Well, hello everyone. Nice to see you all and welcome to the course. And this is our first lecture of many in our first section. And what I'm going to do in this section is talk a bit about the background to the revolution, as you can see there. And I'm going to go on to talk about politics and so on and just really lay the foundations now to give us an idea of the character of the island which is going to experience this revolution. But the place I'd like to start, as you can see, is to talk a bit about the consequences of the famine. Now, I don't want to talk about the famine itself because, I mean, that is another course, on its own. Or maybe I'll do that in the future sometime. But what interests us, I suppose, what is important to us is what the famine does in terms of shaping the economic, political and social character, cultural character as well of Ireland. In fact, the famine, I mean, horrible as the famine is, and, we just need to, I think, acknowledge this just awful, terrible humanitarian disaster, which is the famine. But awful as it is, many historians actually have looked at the famine and said that it is undoubtedly the great turning point in Irish history, in the sense that the island that emerges after the famine is what we might think of as, I say, modern Ireland. It's recognisably modern because it changes, as I say, absolutely everything. So I say we don't want to go into the famine, but we just want to talk about the impact, particularly of the famine on Ireland. The famine from 1845 running up to 1851. And I say the revolution is going to occur in a post-famine Ireland. So I say there's a number of key developments which I want to mention, maybe things you've not thought about and how they impact, as it were, and shape modern Ireland. I mean, it is pretty horrible this in many ways to talk about this, but yeah, the reality is it does change Ireland irrevocably. The first and most obvious thing that the famine does, of course, is population decline. And I'll show you here. Here is the staggering decline of the Irish population between 1841 and 1871. You can see just how enormous. This population almost halves in a period of 30 years. Absolutely incredible. By the census of 1911, so this is just on the edge of our revolution, as it were, the population of Ireland is around 4 million. 4.1 million or so, depends what measurement you use, but it goes down even further now. It's incredible. So this is caused by, let's say, death during the famine, also emigration after the famine, which becomes then a feature of post-famine Ireland. But the fact is, this is a population that goes down and down and down. And I'll just show you again some of the consequences maybe of this. So you can see during the famine it goes down by 20%, but then increasingly goes down and down more and more. So during the famine itself we get the first hit, but it doesn't stop. Ireland's population carries on going into decline. Here's a graph here to show you this. And you can see here, look at the population, look at the cliff edge that we get. So we get to this absolute high point now during the famine, and then it falls completely off a cliff. And I say there's various kind of reasons for that. And the point is, of course, the Irish population never recovers. Never does. To this day, it never recovers. By the end of the 19th century, I say, and before the revolution, it's down to even, 3.9 million, 4 million or so. Even today, Ireland is remarkably rare in having a smaller population than it did 150 years ago. When you look at other populations, you think about, the population, for example, of Britain during, say, the Napoleonic Wars is around 10, 12 million. And now it's whatever it is, 60 million or something today. So everywhere grows. It's just a feature of modernity. Doesn't happen in Ireland. It is kind of remarkable. Now, what does that mean in terms of the impact on Ireland and the consequences? Well, one thing you'd say you do end up with are larger farms. And this is a very important feature. The main reason is, of course, again, horrible as it sounds, but the people who died out during the famine tend to come from the lowest class. They tend to come from the cottier class. So you've lost, as it were, an entire underclass of people have been killed. And what that means is the small little strips of land they were working on now have basically been abandoned. And you get this now, so a smaller population, there's just less people in Ireland. And you get now the consolidation of these tiny little subsistence strips now into slightly larger farms. And you can see that here with this graph here on the bottom right there, just how much, as I say, the little farms, the little cricket pitch kind of farms that you have, people living on their potatoes and so on, living from year to year, they kind of disappear more. There's less of them, and there's now slightly bigger farms. So that's very important. What does it also mean, of course? You get now the creation in Ireland of a whole new phenomenon of what we might call a more middling Catholic farmer class. Never really been that before now, because they've got bigger farms, you see. It's the first ever kind of, I suppose you might call it, a Catholic middle class now develops. So think about this. I say there's a lot more room. There's less people now on the land. So you can make every person that's left has a slightly bigger farm now, which means is far more secure and is far more prosperous. It means you can profit from it. So you can not just living subsistence and living on your potatoes and sort of surviving as best you can. Now you're in a position where you can maybe sell a little bit. I mean, we're not talking about some incredibly wealthy farming class, but we're talking about a group of people now who, I say, have a disposable income. And you can start to talk about a kind of, I say, a Catholic kind of middle class. This group of people are going to be absolutely crucial, politically particularly, because they will be the backbone of the later nationalist political movements going forward. You know, when we look at the Home Rule Party, as we will do next time, that, you know, overwhelmingly support comes from this, I say, this upper working class, lower middle class farming community. And their focus approach is because now they're more middle class, they're more political, they have more of a political voice. And particularly you get this, of course, when you have the Reform Acts in Britain. So 1832, 1867, more people are voting, so you have to earn a certain amount to vote. Now, but these people now are earning a bit more, so they have a vote now, they have a political voice. And their protest particularly, and where the focus of protest is going to be, particularly after the famine, if you want to think about something that's political, or I suppose pseudo-political maybe, I suppose it is political, is about the land. It's about the issue of the land. Because what happens is the pre-famine kind of archaic rights that you have as a farmer on the land now, they haven't changed. So even though you've got now this new sort of, I say, middle class consolidated farms and so on, they're still living with the same kind of insecurities that had kind of led to the famine in the first place. So, for example, the big landowner who you're, as it were, least subletting the land from, they still have the right, for example, to evict you with no notice at all. So if they've just decided, that's not for me, subletting land, what I'll do is I'm going to clear all the land now and you know, have sheep instead, or pasture. That'll do. There's probably more money in that, growing, you know, food, meat and so on that I can sell back in Britain or whatever. And you have no rights at all to stop this happening. And you can see these sort of awful scenes here from the post-famine period. But these people, as I say, are not going to, these are, as it were, more empowered people. And they demand now, as it were, what's called tenant right, which is known in Ireland, by the way, if you ever see this phrase, the 3 Fs. I know what you're thinking, but it's not one of them. But you can see fair rents, fixity of tenure and free sale. Fair rents meaning that some big landowner wants to get rid of you, basically. There's nothing to stop him raising the rents through the roof. And then, well, I can't pay that. Okay, well, you're going to be evicted then. Now it's saying fair rents. There's some kind of arbitration, which is going to make sure the rents are actually kind of reasonable that you can pay. Fixity of tenure, meaning that you can't be just thrown out on a whim. So you have a lease, as it were, on this land. It's going to be 10 years or something. So you can at least know that your family is secure for a while. That's another part of this. And free sale, meaning that if you've worked for those 10 years on the land and you've maybe improved it, which of course you're going to do, you put up a boundary fence or whatever, then the way the system is now, I say before these protests, is that you don't get any pay or consideration for the improvements you made. So it's rather like moving into a house and renting a house out. And you decorate everywhere and you put a new boiler in or whatever, you make it all very swish. And then, the landowner, as it were, the landlord comes to you and says, okay, well, off you go. And you think, I've done all this work, I've spent all this money. I don't care. I'm the one who's going to profit from it. And these are pretty fundamental kind of rights. But so what you get as well, so you get a more active kind of political class now in Catholic Ireland. And also one that becomes, and this, I love this little engraving here, that becomes more respectable. You see, you've got a bit of disposable income now, and you might spend it on a suit of clothes for church. A new respectability, as it were, comes into, I say, this Irish kind of middle class. So I say, just frankly, the fact is, with population, there's far more room. And you get bigger farms, you get more diversification in terms of farming, you get more sheep, as I say, more pasture. You also get, of course, to feed now this new economy, as in, I've got a surplus now, I'm going to sell it because I don't really need it to survive for my family, I want to make a few quid. The growth of small towns, which grow up around markets and things now. So you need a market, and that creates now a burgeoning, the Ireland we all probably know today. If you go to Ireland, you see lots and lots of small towns now. So in this sense, you can see hopefully that the implications of the famine are very deep in terms of creating, I say, modern Ireland, creating what really is a modern civic culture. That's a good way of kind of explaining it. And I say, so that's a very important point to make. Less people equals more land equals more prosperity for those that remain, and they become a new politicized class. So that's one thing. Another impact, another consequence of the famine, again, maybe something you've not considered, but it's this. The decline now of Gaelic-speaking communities. And look how much that declines. You'll notice the areas that were hardest hit by the famine, which usually is in the west of Ireland, Connaught and Munster and so on, and West Ulster and so on. These areas tended to be the places that spoke the Gaelic language more. But with their death, again, it's awful, isn't it, to say this? It really sounds awful, but with the fact that there's people dying and many people, of course, emigrating as well, you lose a lot of these people now. That's just a simple fact of the matter. And I see you can see the decline going up to 1900 now as the language kind of disappears. That will mean, and we'll talk about this when we talk about nationalism, of course. A number of the nationalist campaigns will be about trying to save the language, save the Irish culture that's declining and disappearing. The real Ireland, as it were, the authentic Ireland. It's a very typically nationalist thing to do. You get this in most countries, but in Ireland, as I say, you can see why there's this kind of sense of imminent decline now and inexorable decline, which needs to be kind of arrested. I say also, we've mentioned this already, but just to mention again, we talk about emigration. And emigration, I say, is not just about famine emigration. You create now a culture, as it were, of emigration, meaning that even after the famine now, there's a trend to leave Ireland. It becomes a thing people do. It's an option for you, as it were, going forward. And again, think about it this way. Think about these farmers. Now, say I'm a farmer and I've got my consolidated farm, now my new middle class farm, say, and I've got, these aren't massive, but they're good solid, there's 30 or 40 acres or something. I can live off that. Now, what happens if I have, say, 4 children now, and 4 boys particularly? What do I do with my, now, usually the case had been you divide it up. I give everyone a bit each. But you see, after the famine, people are far more wary of that. Because what happened before, if you divide it up and then they divide it, everyone ends up with the cricket pitch things, the strips of land, starvation. That's the problem. Famine's going to come again. So you don't get that as much in Ireland now. It tends to be left to the oldest son. And there's a great old joke in Ireland, which I think there is some kind of truth in it, as there are in many of these old jokes, is that, a father, as I say, like me, we say, with 4 sons, the oldest one inherits the farm. The second one goes into the priesthood. the third one emigrates, and the fourth one joins the IRA. There's a okay. There's a joke, a stereotype, whatever, caricature. But you can kind of see now there's different options, and as the emigration therefore becomes an option for you, because you're not really going to inherit the farm. Not all of the children are going to inherit land. Where's your future going to be? And it's often out of Ireland. So, as I say, it becomes part of the kind of Irish psyche, even today, of course, very strong. We think about Irish America, we think about the strength and power of expatriate nationalism, for example. So that's another factor. So Ireland, I think the point is, always has a release valve. And this is what we mean about the way the population never really recovers, because people are leaving. There's always this way that people are escaping, and lots of young people always leave and go off to the United States or Britain, and particularly the United States. I haven't included Britain here, but a lot of people go to Britain as well. So it always means that Ireland's population is constantly emptying this country now. I'd say right throughout this period. So that's a new kind of change in terms of its culture. Another factor, and this is another interesting thing, which again you may not have thought of or may not know this. It also leads, it has been argued very strongly, to the rise of the Catholic Church in Ireland. Now, I always say this to my undergraduates, and no one believes me, but Ireland is not really in any sense before the famine a Catholic country. Now, it's Catholic in name, certainly, but when you actually look at it in practice, when you actually look at how many priests are there, and you look at the kind of beliefs that people have, they're a kind of mix of old pagan beliefs and a bit of strange Christianity kind of thrown in. This isn't in any way, aside from in name, as I say, can be considered a Catholic country. But what happens is, after the famine, is what Emmett Larkin, the historian, has called a devotional revolution. Meaning now that you get, certainly Cardinal Cullen, for example, comes over, Rome trained, and he establishes now what we think of, as it were, of the Irish Catholic Church today, which is lots of churches, lots of personnel, lots of teaching, education and so on, and really gets right into the heart of Ireland now. And so it's almost like a missionary kind of zeal that he has. And that really transforms Ireland into what we could recognise as a Catholic country in the later 19th century. It is kind of remarkable. Now, why are people open to that now maybe than not before? Well, there's a very obvious reason, of course, because the famine has shown them that the old Celtic pagan ways, as it were, have not worked. So the odd idea of doing little fertility ceremonies or whatever, or sacrifices of some kind in the fields to ensure the harvest next year, doesn't work. So people lose faith in the old ways now. And the Catholic Church is very good at saying to them, well, that's because you're so godless. That's the reason it went wrong, and you believe in all these kind of crazy pagan kind of ideas. So the two things kind of go together. So as a belief system now, Catholicism has an open door, as it were, and it works. And remember, as you saw there with the going to mass thing, part of the respectability of being kind of middle class now, and you're all dressed up, you and your wife, is going to mass on Sunday. It's a very respectable thing to do. This is going on in Britain, for years now. Sunday best and so on. So everything kind of comes together in that sense. So Catholicism is very, very important, and the domination, particularly of the Catholic Church, there's a growth of it in the second half of the 19th century. Final point to make, the final great result of this, of course, is the growth of Irish nationalism. Now we're going to talk about that in much, much more detail in our subsequent lectures. But I think what lays at root of Irish nationalism, why the famine's important, is the perception that it's the union with Britain that essentially lay at the root of the famine. That was the problem. So the famine had shown up that the union itself was not beneficial for Ireland, of course. That's the argument. It was at best inefficient because it hadn't fed people, it hadn't solved the problem. And at worst, it's perfidious. So, you get someone like John Mitchell, for example, the radical John Mitchell, making the point that, what would have happened if the famine had occurred in Yorkshire, say? What would have happened? Would we have had the same level of cataclysm? No. And so you're turning it now into a political kind of issue. And again, as we said, there's a constituency there now who are empowered politically, ready to listen to that. So you get now, as it were, the rise of mass nationalism. So the land issue is one thing, of course, but now there are calls for maybe the changes need to be even deeper than that now. Maybe it's the union itself, and calls now for repeal of the union and the creation now of an Irish Assembly in Dublin. And this is going to be, the principal political campaign which is going to shape Ireland now until independence, which is all summed up, of course, in the phrase Home Rule. The demand for Home Rule now, a native Irish devolved parliament, still very much part of the British Empire and so on, with the king still is in charge, but has a lot now of local power and will be able to deal with issues such as the famine and so on. So you see, there's a kind of, Ireland is kind of looking after the famine, the humiliation of the famine. Peter Gray wrote an article on this, which I thought was very interesting. He talked about the famine and national humiliation. There is a sense of that, how you've been completely degraded. And there's this kind of, you can see a growing wish for, as it were, self-respect now, on a personal level, on a cultural level, and on a political level as well. That's what Ireland particularly wants. So Ireland now is, as it were, after the famine, is kind of leaner and meaner now, and is ready to engage in these campaigns. And what we'll do next time, I say the first part of talking about nationalism, is talk about the Home Rule movement and talk about constitutional nationalism, which completely dominates now Irish political culture, Catholic Ireland's political culture now, right up until the revolution. And in many ways what we'll see is the revolution itself is not just about overthrowing, as it were, British rule in Ireland. In many ways it's an internal revolution within Irish nationalism itself, where the old Home Rule movement is going to be overthrown now by more radical calls for not just Home Rule, not just devolution, but full Republican independence. And I say that's going to be that's another theme, as it were, the shape of our story kind of going forward. Okay, folks, so I say we'll talk about constitutional nationalism next week. Take care.